So we'll get underway. Want to say at the outset that our tradition, Sterling, is for me to restrain myself from taking up a lot of time in introducing our guests, especially difficult today with our most distinguished guest and friend. Let me just say that instead of trying to encapsulate or summarize the accomplishments of our speaker, let me emphasize to you the importance, just make it a point to read his works. He has distinguished himself in so many areas of research. All of them touch upon what we try to do here. History of slavery in the Americas, especially North America, the U.S., postbellum cultural history, intellectual history, folklore, art criticism, and of course religion. And I think the way to think about a way to think about the work of Sterling Stuckey is that, of course, he was a pioneer, someone who modeled what we call transdisciplinary work long before anyone here ever heard of that. So that I think a breakthrough for the study of religion interested in, of course, modern developments and discourses is his sort of classic article, their classic works as monographs, Through the Prism of Folklore, the Black Ethos of Slavery, written in the 60s, and appears just everywhere. Anyone concerned about the study of modern slaveries and precursors, and black agency as a part of the complex dynamics there. Ideological origins of black nationalism, slave culture, African culture, and Melville's art. It goes on and on. Sterling Stuckey was for many years distinguished professor of history, and I think also other departments, including religion, at least sort of. And we are really fortunate that he remains in the area, and just delighted that he could be with us today. I have been an admirer for many years and followed his work. I was fortunate to get him to work with us with a couple of students during New York years, and he's proved that he's a friend and supporter of ISS as a kind of development from the days of those projects. So I'm just delighted, personal terms, professional terms, Sterling, to have you here today with us, and we're pleased to hear from you about Paul Robeson, and you do whatever you like with that. Yeah. So thank you for being with us.
Thanks for the invitation. When Vincent asked me last year to come here to give a talk on Robeson, I begged off because I've been working on Robeson for a long time, and then became very involved with Herman Melville, and it was a never-ending process, it seemed. I'm getting older all the while, you see. And I finally finished the Melville book and returned to Robeson, and so I just didn't want to take on any speaking engagements, and I did not. But I guess it was sort of like Wendell Phillips when asked to speak on slavery. He said yes, you know. So I just delayed it for a year, and so I'm happy to be here, and really happy to see students. The students were my salvation for a long, long time when I was teaching at Northwestern, especially, and were very helpful to me when I was working on Melville at UC Riverside. In fact, some of the major breakthroughs resulted from student involvement in seminars, and of course called the Arts and History. So it's great to see students here. I want to be certain that since it's such a big subject, that I begin with, in a sense, the heart of Robeson's argument about religion. At least I just want to introduce it along the way, and I will do that sort of at the outset, and then I will talk in some detail about his formative years and beyond. It seems to me that he has made two really groundbreaking discoveries with respect to, well, not necessarily discoveries, but contributions to the understanding and appreciation of black religion. One of them is made in a somewhat curious way, in that he was the first important artist to affirm the richness and vitality and indispensability of Negro dialect when performing on concert stages, when performing concerts that consisted mainly of slave music. That he did for some 5 years. Against a tremendous amount of opposition within the black intellectual community. Some very distinguished people, the most distinguished of whom was James Weldon Johnson, who in 1922 argued basically that Negro dialect should be sort of off limits, certainly to poets, and by implication, since the spirituals are in the realm of poetry as well, to musicians. This was in a book that he did in 1922 on an introduction to Negro poetry. So this is a real luminary, but it turns out, as you read him, that he bases his opposition to dialect primarily on his concern about the way it's used in Joel Chandler Harris' slave tales. He was unaware of the collecting of William John Faulkner, one of the greatest collectors of slave tales, who finally published a book called The Days When the Animals Talked. He was unaware, or at least unmindful, it seems, of another truly remarkable collection of tales by E.C.L. Adams out of South Carolina, Tales of the Congaree, both of which were in dialect, both of which provide pathways to the ancestral heritage of black people in America in Africa. That is to say, to specific African ethnic peoples, which you cannot find I've not seen it in works of slave tales in regular English. Here's what Robeson had to say about Negro dialect after he had won the gold medal for diction in the American theater, given out by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences for diction in Shakespearean English. He gave an interview to a black college professor in 1944 in Columbia, South Carolina. He said, "The spirituals in Negro dialect were also a part of my earliest background. My father was the minister of a small Negro community, and so spirituals must have been known to me before I was born. I learned Negro dialect and the spirituals as I learned to talk and walk and breathe and sing." The Negro community in New Jersey, where I grew up, was made up of Negroes from the South, particularly from the rural sections of North Carolina. Although living in New Jersey, they clung to their old habits of speech. Their customs and traditions also persisted, and in fact persist to this day, persist to 1944. Although I have been fortunate to receive a good education and have traveled widely, nevertheless I have rarely lost touch with my childhood, and the pictures, sounds, rhythms of that background have never faded from my memory. I have definitely kept them fresh in my consciousness, because the more I traveled and saw the world, the more I learned of people and their speech and customs. the more fully I came to appreciate the fact that the speech and customs of my people are rich, beautiful, vigorous, and important, and that they can and should be a rewarding contribution to world culture. Recognizing the richness and fullness of Negro dialect, I never felt any inferiority in using it. Many Negroes are prone to underrate this rich heritage. James Weldon Johnson was, in a certain sense, prone to underrate it. He was a very close friend of Robeson, a booster of Robeson. Gave very few dinner parties in New York without inviting Paul Robeson. So they were close friends. So that's one barrier, Johnson's attitude about dialect, that somehow had to be transcended by, I think, by not only black poets, but black musicians, especially those interested in folk music, more precisely in the music of their ancestors who were enslaved in this country. Another figure who perhaps was even more influential than Johnson at a later period was Ralph Ellison, who speaks to us of dialect being moribund. Why would black writers turn to dialect when they have the examples of writers of the stature of Melville and Walt Whitman around? Their works are available to them, so why do they engage in that? He did that without having carefully read Moby Dick. Because one of the most powerful expressions of dialect is found in Moby Dick, used by Herman Melville. Ellison has said that we need something revolutionary. Dialect is not revolutionary. It's certainly revolutionary in the way that Melville uses it. It is revolutionary in a way that I'm going to now, I think, demonstrate to you from a slave tale in dialect called I Got a Home in Dat Rock. I got a home in that rock, don't you see? I got a home in that rock, don't you see? Between the earth and sky, I thought I heard my Savior cry, you got a home in that rock, don't you see? Poor man Lazarus, poor as I, don't you see? Poor man Lazarus, poor as I, don't you see? Poor man Lazarus, poor as I, when he died, he found a home on high. He had a home in that rock, don't you see? Rich man Dives, he lived so well, don't you see? Rich man Dives, he lived so well, don't you see? Rich man Dives, he lived so well, when he died, he found a home in hell. He had no home in that rock, don't you see? God gave Noah the rainbow sign, don't you see? God gave Noah the rainbow sign, don't you see? God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, but fire next time. So Robeson's use of dialect is one example of how he opens a new pathway to understanding the ancestral heritage of blacks in America and to giving sort of a rebirth to slave genius on the concert stages of the world. Before the man had completed his first 6 months of concertizing in 1925, he was being hailed by certain critics in this country as the greatest singer alive. Before he completed the first year of concertizing, Du Bois said he had spread the pure Negro folk song throughout the civilized world. I should add that his accompanist, Lawrence Brown, undoubtedly played an important role, a very accomplished musician out of Florida, who believed in the use of dialect, didn't oppose Paul. Paul listened to him. He's extremely knowledgeable. So Lawrence Brown is due a lot of credit as well for his, you'll hear him singing on a selection a bit later, along with Paul. But perhaps, well, and certainly an equally important contribution with respect to black religion. Robeson has written that the spirituals are the souls of black people made manifest. The spirituals are the souls of black people made manifest. The soul of black people made manifest. But the second great contribution was that Robeson was one who affirmed the most sacred of all African rituals during slavery and since slavery, and it's called the ring shout. It's a counterclockwise sacred dance that was performed when the spirituals came into being. The spirituals were created within the context of this so-called ring shout. So were the blues. Frederick Douglass, in Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, writes about this shout in a very subtle way, saying the circle, when I was in the circle, and he talks about what he heard when he was in the circle. And what he heard, he said, was a melancholy music boiling over with the bitterest anguish. A music that was boiling over with the bitterest anguish. Almost every tone was an appeal to God for help, basically. So it was a sacred music, not the spirituals now. So we find Douglass describing a music that he heard in Maryland, not in Mississippi, in the Upper South in the 1820s on Colonel Lloyd's plantation. A music that boiled over with the bitterest anguish. The blues, a sacred blues. I've written about this in some detail in the Melville book. What Robeson did, however, was to take the spirituals out of that circle to the concert stage. And that was a very significant development in its own right. Marian Anderson had sung the spirituals, Roland Hayes had sung the spirituals, but Robeson sang entire programs consisting of slave music in dialect, mainly spirituals and to some extent work songs. The soul of the race made manifest was this music that was where the spirituals and the blues were bound together. Now this is, I should point out in all candor, an unconventional argument. It's a highly unconventional argument. This is the argument that I make in a book on Herman Melville called African Culture and Melville's Art, the creative process in Benito Cereno and Moby Dick. And at the time I wrote that book, I was absolutely convinced that one hears the blues in Moby Dick. And then I talked to a very distinguished student of black music, Samuel Floyd Jr., who wrote a book called The Power of Black Music. And Sam says, Sterling, you've got the blues in Benito Cereno as well. That hadn't occurred to me, so I have to credit him with that. Though I found it in a place in addition to where he found it, in Benito Cereno. So you've got America's greatest writer studying Douglass very, very closely enough to use Douglass's dialectical approach of cheer and gloom in talking about the blues, to use that in Moby Dick, to use those essential elements of Douglass's dialectic in Moby Dick. We find him now using it as well in Benito Cereno. Moby Dick appeared in 1851. The going thesis among students of music in this country is that the blues were created at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, after slavery. But slavery didn't give you the blues. We have Douglass writing about this music of the blues in the 1820s in Maryland. So that's an argument that has been put out there for the first time in the Melville book, and the argument about the blues in Benito Cereno is an argument that I'm making in a current piece on Melville that I'm working. Melville and Douglass. The argument is not terribly acceptable in certain circles in this country among intellectuals. I quote Adrian Rich, one of the finest poets in America, in the Melville book, saying Frederick Douglass wrote a purer English than John Milton. The editors of the book in which I published one of these essays, which became the last chapter in the Melville book, took it away, took it out. No, you cannot imagine how angry that made me, how annoyed I was. Samuel Otter and Robert Levine. To Levine's credit, Sterling, I didn't know that. It was probably Otter who did it. I'll put it right back in. There'll be no more changes to your manuscript. So there is tension in literary circles over this matter of Melville's relationship to Douglas, Douglas's relationship to John Milton, and now Douglas's relationship to William Shakespeare. I merely posed the question to learned scholars. Was William Shakespeare a greater influence on Douglas and Moby Dick, on Melville and Moby Dick than Douglas? The question is still out there. Okay. So Robeson has been important as a performer and a theorist of black culture, a theorist of black music.
That your people were not able to do anything as free people for a long, long while. But they struggled. They fought. They made up their songs and they struggled ahead. A Harriet Tubman, a Sojourner Truth, a Frederick Douglass, helped by a William Lloyd Garrison and by a John Brown. And I escaped by the underground, so you stand your ground. You may have to stand there for a little while longer, you know. Just keep your courage. And keep your heart. Every time I see the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. Every time I see the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. On the mountain, my Lord spoke. Out his mouth came fire and smoke. In the valley on my knees, ask my Lord have mercy please. Every time, Lord, moving in my heart, I will pray. Every time I see Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. Jordan River, chilly and cold, till the body button of the soul. All around me looks so shine, ask my Lord if all was mine. Every time I see Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. Every time I see the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray.
That was a birthday celebration for Robeson in Detroit, in the Baptist Church in 1952. It came at the high tide of the Cold War during systematic blacklisting of Robeson. He had gone from singing in Carnegie Hall and some of the most distinguished halls in this country to having to sing in a few black churches here and there and a few Jewish synagogues. Sometimes you might be in the church and there might be 40 or 50 people in there because of the blacklisting, and perhaps we can get into that a bit later. Around that time, he received a letter from Albert Einstein. He had known Einstein for a number of years, having met him in Princeton after a performance of Othello and after a concert in Princeton when Einstein came backstage and they talked. And Einstein had also been a supporter of a crusade against American Crusade against lynching that led to Robeson representing the crusade at the White House in a talk with Harry Truman about lynching. Einstein, in his letter, said, Paul, I haven't seen you in a good while. Can you come to Princeton to see me? And so Paul and his associate, Lloyd Brown, drove to Princeton to see Einstein. Einstein's secretary led them into Einstein's study, and Einstein was on his cot with a fly swatter in his hands, looked at Paul and smiled and said, "This is my war." W-A-R, this is my war. Simply opposing. He's a man of peace, in other words. At one point he asked Paul how things are going, and Paul said things are going pretty well, and Lloyd said, I can't let that go, Dr. Einstein. Paul is being blacklisted. FBI agents are outside the churches and synagogues taking down the license plate numbers of people attending his concerts. So things aren't going well at all, and Einstein looked up at his secretary and said, Helen, I suppose the two of us can safely go to a Paul Robeson concert because I don't have a car. Of course, he was the most recognizable figure on earth, probably, Albert Einstein. Paul says to Einstein at one point, reminding him that they had met in Princeton and so on, and that was his birthplace. Einstein's response was, I thought people only died in Princeton. And that in part was because when Einstein came from Germany to the Institute at Princeton, the director of the Institute was censoring his mail on grounds that he wanted to be certain that Einstein was not wasting time, if you can imagine that. Einstein says, I thought people only died in Princeton. Robeson has written of Princeton that it was spiritually located in Dixie. He's born in Princeton in 1898. It says that Princeton was spiritually located in Dixie. One has to understand that New Jersey was the only state in the North that did not ratify the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. That Princeton's faculty and student body mainly came from below the Mason-Dixon line. And that's where Paul says its heart was, in the South. He remarks further that in Princeton one smelled, one encountered the decaying smell of the plantation big house mingled with the crisper smell of the counting house. And that its mind, like the mind of the South, was in Wall Street. So Princeton was a place in which segregation was very rigidly applied in the schools and practically every avenue of life in Princeton. The university was sort of in control of developments. It was like a plantation, Robeson says, like a plantation in Georgia. So that was the atmosphere in which Robeson had his formative experiences. He says, the theology was Calvin, the religion Cash. And many of the black people there in Princeton were employed in one capacity or another by the university. It has been remarked, well, I'm not going to go through all these details because we're not going to have time, but both Paul's mother and father were outstanding intellectuals. His mother was of Quaker background as well as African American. His father had escaped from slavery in North Carolina via the Underground Railroad, had gone to Lincoln University and had won honors in Greek and Latin. And his father was a really stern taskmaster by example rather than programmatically. He didn't deliver sermons on it, he just conducted himself in a manner that led Paul to believe that under no circumstances should he not attempt to fulfill his potential to the maximum degree. If he brought home a grade of 95. The father was not excited about it because there was 100 that you could make. He probably brought home relatively few hundreds, but he did finish at the head of his elementary school. He finished at the head of his high school, and for the first 3 years of his time at Rutgers University, he was the top scholar there. He won a statewide competition for a 4-year scholarship to Rutgers, and it was said that he made the highest score ever made on that particular exam. Robeson, in attempting to be unbending, in attempting to never giving up, as his father would have had him do, did everything in his power to advance the interests of black people as a whole, because his father wanted him to help open the way for other black youngsters who might want to go to Rutgers. He went out for the football team. There had been no black on the football team at Rutgers, and they had warned him, if you come out, we're going to kill you, they being some of the players. And on the first day of scrimmage, his nose was broken where one of his teammates came over and just fell on his nose, on his face with his knee. Another fell on his shoulder, dislocating his shoulder. Paul was in bed for about 2 weeks, and he didn't want to go back to play. And so his brother, visiting from the University of the East, said, "Okay, Paul, you'll be the first Robeson to ever quit." So he had to go back out. He was only 17 years of age. He said they gave the ball to the top runner on the team, a player named Kelly. And again, they were sweeping around his end. And in doing so, while he was down, one of his teammates cleated his right hand, wrenching all the fingernails off his hand. He said the bones held, but they wrenched all the fingernails off my hand. He said, it was then that I knew rage. Kelly got the ball again with the other 3 backs running interference for him. I just stuck out my arm like this, and they just seemed to go down. They went down. I got Kelly up over my head like this, decided I would break him in two, knew that I could, at which point the coach said, "Roby, you've made the team." And he let him down. He was All-American, as you probably know, for 2 years in succession. Walter Camp, the arbiter of the sport, called him the greatest football player that he had ever seen. The greatest end that he had ever seen. And it was generally acknowledged that he was extremely quick to size up what the play was going to be and to be at the center of the action each time. Playing against a West Virginia team, his opposing end said to him, "You black dog, I'm going to cut your heart out." And for the next play, the ball was snapped. Robeson said he struck him below his waist so hard that he almost tore him in two. And while they were at the bottom of the pile, Robeson said, I leaned over and said, "I touched you. How did you like it?" So he was also very tough. Let me talk about a few things that are unknown about Robeson at Rutgers. While there, he published 3 articles before graduating from Rutgers. He began to give speeches on campus that were on and off campus that were sponsored primarily by the Young Men's Christian Association. That's for someone to look up the YMCA in the first quarter of the 20th century, especially their activities in the East, because they had a relationship with Bert Williams, a great comedian and actor, as well as with Paul Robeson. The New Brunswick Y, I think probably was in a certain sense Robeson's salvation, because he was not allowed to go to the junior prom, he was not allowed to sing in the glee club, he was not allowed to have a roommate until a second black joined the student body while he was there, when I think he was a junior at the time. He was not allowed to go to social events. he went to the annual football dinner given by the citizens of New Brunswick in December of 1915, his first year, only to discover that an invitation had been sent to him by accident. When Rutgers was celebrating the 150th anniversary of its birth against Washington and Lee University out of Virginia, and the greatest celebration really in the history of Rutgers up to that point was held with people converging on the stadium around the time for the game. Robeson was told that he could not play the game because Washington and Lee did not want him to play, and therefore he was kept on the bench. So there were these humiliations. There were close to 3,000 lynchings from about 1885 down to about 1915 in America without anyone being apprehended and prosecuted. These lynchings were being reported in the papers. The New Brunswick Home News reported on terrible punishment that was meted out to black soldiers in Houston, Texas in December of 1917. Soldiers whose weapons were taken from them, this company of black soldiers, at a time when white policemen and white men were being abusive to black women on the streets of Houston. They apparently thought that these soldiers should not have their weapons. These men went and got their weapons anyway, went out and met the mob, shot 15 of them dead, and wounded a great deal more of them, and were simultaneously, 15 of them were simultaneously executed in secrecy. This was reported on the front page of the New Brunswick Home News. Rutgers is in New Brunswick. Robeson read it. Prior to that time, in May of 1917, there was all lynchings were terrible, but this was a particularly atrocious lynching. I don't like the language. This was an especially revolting lynching. Well, they all are. What am I left with? It was terrible because the Memphis Commercial Appeal was giving headlines announcing when the lynching might be, days before the lynching. No word from Woodrow Wilson, who was the president. He had been the president of Princeton University. He had been for 10 years a professor at Princeton. He had been the governor of New Jersey. No word from him. He was a Virginian. Not only was L. Persons lynched, but before he was killed, they poured gasoline on him, sat a 10-year-old black boy beside him, then lit the gasoline as the flames were leaping about. Naturally, the little boy was terrorized by this. He was told, let this be a lesson to you to never have anything to do with a white woman. The proof that L. Persons had killed the white girl was they said that when they looked at the pupils of her eyes, there was his image. So that was fraudulent. Du Bois was doing a tremendous job of reporting these incidents in the Crisis magazine. I don't think he's gotten the sort of attention, the work that he did there that he deserves for that period from roughly 1910 to 1920. But there was a silent parade down Fifth Avenue in New York in July of 1917 that Robeson joined. Robeson was in this parade. It was an all-black parade of 15,000 people, including scores of young children in this parade in the line of march. And the only thing that could be heard were the sound of drums in this parade. But Robeson was a follower of Du Bois at the time, and remarked that he followed Du Bois. He read the Crisis religiously. So he was very much on top of these developments that were being reported in the Crisis around the country involving race and black people. Let me just make one more remark because I'm running out of time. Robeson's valedictory address at Rutgers is one of the most interesting documents that I've read on the subject of freedom in America. His valedictory address. I think one of the most thoughtful statements on freedom that I have read. It was written when he was about 20 years of age. And it's deeply influenced by his religious views. He basically calls for the transformation of American society and for it to be a reflection of the divine. Despite all that he was doing, he was playing football, he was playing baseball, he was playing track, and playing basketball, he somehow found a way to Somerville to teach Sunday school on Sundays and to sing in the choir. Such was his commitment. That was his father's church. It was a Methodist church in Somerville. So he had this terrific commitment to his religious values, and that too is related to the attitude of the YMCA toward him, undoubtedly. I don't know enough about his relationship. I know probably more than anyone else knows about it because no one has written about that. I don't know enough about it. I'd like to know a lot more about it. So he expended a great deal of energy. Football practice alone took up 18 hours a week. The average student was said to have studied about 18 hours a week. In 1949, in the Christian Science Monitor, in an interview with the Christian Science, not an interview, but an article in the Christian Science Monitor, he remarks in that piece that after football practice, he would go back to his dorm, take a few hours of rest, of sleep, get up and study because he wanted to demonstrate that black boys and girls were the equals of whites intellectually. He says the equals of Anglo-Saxons, as he put it, intellectually. He didn't talk about the superior. He was at the head of his class. He didn't finish at the head of his class because after his father's death, it had a real hard impact on him. But I guess that's as much as why don't we talk about it?
Okay.
Whatever you want to talk about.
Well, thank you, Sterling. Let's take some minutes while we have this distinguished historian and critic with us to gain some perspective, more perspective on his work, just a wealth of information and perspective to be sure, and build bridges to the kind of conversations that we're having and the kind of work that we're doing. Let me take the opportunity to just open things up. Sterling, I want to ask what, it does strike me that Robeson is a figure who helps us open up a lot of issues, a lot of problems for critical interpretation around, formation issues, forms of protest, deformation, and so forth. So we can, his background on the one hand suggests with his father as pretty staunch Afro-Calvinist. I mean, we can begin there. It reminds me of what the issues you broach in slave culture, and I suspect other places, but I have in mind slave culture, that so the Bishop Payne figure strikes me as one kind of historical figure who represents a way forward in formation with the use of Calvinist bourgeois religion, something like that, with all that the ring shout represents in studied opposition to that. And I wonder where, and then there's that famous excerpt, you excerpt Paine's comment that these people are, they're out of control. Some of them ought to be put out of church. They're not kind of respectable, like Methodists of a sort. And I think it was that famous comment, I think he gets close to saying something like this, that the only thing that will save them is if we need a St. Paul or something like that to save them. I remember that, something like that. Now, that sets up for me some tensions around issues around agency and resistance and formation. And I wonder how if you could help us think about Robeson as a particular kind of figure in all of this. So it strikes me that he's a carrier of a lot of these. I mean, he represents some of these tensions. So by virtue of background in the home, he could have easily followed Bishop Paine in some respects. But of course, we know that you're telling us today, and that is consistent with what you've written, that of course he takes up many of the more radical Africanist gestures, orientations to the world, ring shout, certainly the music and all that represents. But is he? How do you understand him? Does he represent ultimately, with his long and complicated life, one of those options more than the other? Does he live with the tension himself? How might we understand him in relationship to these kind of streams? Does that make sense, what I'm trying to set up there?
I think his father was a particularly gentle person.
Mm-hmm.
Not one who, as Martin Duhlman argues in his book on Robeson, who drummed things into Robeson's head. That was not his father.
Okay.
Shirley Graham says that he was sane and gentle, and I think she's right in her book on Robeson. Robeson says that he taught them very little by preachment. It was the example of his life that was enduring as far as his children were concerned, and that example in Paul's case was so powerful that he said he would follow it until his last breath, and he did. He must have asked himself along the way, should I have done that? He had to have asked himself, given the sort of pressure that was brought to bear on him. But I think that the faith was a renewing experience for him. That there was probably very little that was doctrinaire about the faith, and the faith was substantially transformed by his study of African folklore, of African religion, and African languages, and so on. So he infused the Christian faith that most blacks knew in this country by talking about that which was African in that faith. The music, the dance, and so on, the folklore, and he was so right about that. He was so right about that. It's confirmed by the studies that studies of which I'm aware of. Now, he was therefore I think a lonely figure. It was in 1931, I think, that he writes the topic sentence of an essay of his is sometimes I think I'm the only black man in America who does not want to be white. Mm-hmm. He writes that. Sometimes I think I'm the only black man in America who does not want to be white. I looked at it again last night. I thought, well, Paul, Du Bois was alive. Dr. Du Bois was warning us of allowing ourselves to be, how does he put it, to be bleached on the floor of white Americanism. Mm-hmm. They became great friends. This is something you should know. Du Bois mentions Robeson about 6 times when he was still a teenager in the Crisis magazine. About 6 times. One summer, June, July, and August, Robeson is in there. Because Du Bois appreciated Robeson as an athlete. I knew that Du Bois played tennis because an uncle of mine an uncle by marriage of mine played tennis with him. But I didn't know he had an interest in football. But there's a wonderful quote in the Crisis about football and how certain athletes had brought black athletes that brought football to the attention of America. So I think that Paul was very lonely. He was being criticized by many blacks, lionized by many blacks, and criticized by many blacks for studying all those languages they were saying, when he should be back here doing this or that. But he had a purpose in studying those languages. Paul also leaves the door slightly ajar, I'd say, for recognizing that his father perhaps would go into the possession state. Refer to him getting happy at times. Unusual in a way for this man who was a fine student of Latin and a fine student of Greek. Maybe it's not unusual at all. I knew more about ancient history. Maybe it's not unusual at all. But anyway, that was, Reverend Robeson. So Paul loved Mahalia Jackson, as he did on one occasion. I challenged those opera singers to take those ballparks the way Mahalia does. Because he had a concert in Chicago around 1941 with about 150,000 people present in Grant Park. I was in Mahalia Jackson's, I'm not just dropping names, class, students, but I was in Mahalia Jackson's home in 1960, and on her mantelpiece was a picture of Paul Robeson on one end. On the other end, you couldn't guess, Liberace. but she and Robeson were very good friends. And he deeply appreciated her. He said the songs she sings are simply sermons that are sung. Gospel songs are sermons that are sung. This is Robeson. And that I hadn't seen. Perhaps it...
Well, why don't let's see if we can get some other questions on the table, and we'll go as far as we can. Tia, and then Richard.
So you said that Robeson took the spirituals from the shout circle to the concert stage. And I was wondering if you thought that in that sort of movement from one context to another, anything was lost, or if the change of context changed the way the spirituals functioned as the souls of black people made manifest, as you said earlier. How did that sort of change in terms of from a separate...
By his having done what?
By his having...
Concertized.
Yeah, concertized the...
That's a good question, of course. James Weldon Johnson seems to argue that it didn't change that much. He refers to, in contrasting Robeson with Roland Hayes, that Robeson's approach was, he puts the term primitive. And then he talks about, you read it in his preface to the Book of Negro Spirituals, then he talks about Roland Hayes. I got the sense that Johnson preferred Hayes's approach to song, but this was before he realized that Roland Hayes would eventually reveal that when he sang the spirituals, he was trying to sound white. When he sang, he was trying to sound white. He told that to his mother, and she said, "Now go on, son, and be your own man." So it's not an easy question to answer. I think that Robeson's singing of the spirituals was undoubtedly different from, personally I feel, different from anyone else that I've heard sing the spirituals. In many ways probably see, when he talked about that Princeton being a plantation, he had in mind as well all those relatives of his who moved to Princeton from North Carolina, relatives of his father, all of whom were ex-slaves, except if they had children. So when they sang, "Yes, I heard my people," he said, "Yes, I heard my people," here he is, "Yes, I heard my people singing in the glow of parlor coal stove and on summer porches sweet with lilac air, from choir loft and Sunday morning pews, and my soul was filled with their harmonies." And my soul was filled with their harmonies. He identified with the people and thought that the music was great music, and so he embraces it. But still, you may well be right that the songs are a bit different when he sings them. And he's probably closer to the original singing of the spirituals than most of the other artists, who sort of abandons dialect in most cases.
But you know, it's if I could tag onto this quickly and get to Richard's question, it brings up just a fundamental question about how culture travels and what happens to it in these different contexts. So, so we want to be careful with the assumption that there was this sort of pure, you know, it's sort of bounded, and it's just pure culture, Africanist or whatever. But of course, the spirituals, and I'll defer to you about blues and jazz as it goes on, but the spirituals represent sort of a point of contact with the larger culture insofar as it's biblical interpretation. So there's a sense in which that's already an example of miscegenated culture, kind of this mixing, but it doesn't mean that's never the same thing as loss, and that's what that, you know, we tend to think that the negotiation or the interaction or something always means, you know, it's like a total loss. It's the purists who are arguing that, of course, it means just by virtue of being in this context, these African peoples lost everything, and that's not. It's always much more dynamic than that, as, for example, the ring shout, as you've taught us, will show us. But all of it is kind of profound sort of interaction, if you will, and I'm not sure we've gotten a handle on what all that means. And I wonder if the dialect, the effort to retain dialect in speech and song, for example, you know, if that complicates his notion of negotiation, interaction, or a kind of translation, if you will. What it means to hold on to it, what it means to allow it to change, and what it itself means in the different contexts.
But it does change.
Sure.
Dialect, I have not heard, well, let me put it this way. More often than not, when Paul is singing a song in dialect, all of the words are not in dialect.
So in the one song, in sort of one concert or song, you'll change, you'll switch.
Well, and a particular song can have certain words in dialect, and the other words are not in dialect.
Yeah.
And you hear this in his singing. Which is to say that if you are a poet, certain words may be in dialect and others are not in dialect. But Robeson felt that, at least at one point, and I think he felt different things at different times about this music. When he was a young singer, singing when he was in his 20s, he probably had a different feeling about, somewhat different feeling about the spirituals than after he had gone to the London University and studied these African languages and so forth. He knew more about linguistics and the like. See, so he felt that having been exposed to Negro dialect had made it easier for him to learn African languages. He told Melville Herskovitz, the anthropologist. So Herskovitz proceeded to write to his professors at the London School of Oriental Languages and said, is that so that if Robeson had had prior exposure to Negro dialect, that made it easier for him to learn African languages? One of the professors wrote back and said, no, he was just brilliant in languages. But I think the jury's out on that, because unless that professor himself had been immersed in dialect as well. So Paul, I think, had different feelings about dialect, but at one moment, and perhaps for a longer period of time, he felt that the larger society was interpreting spirituals far too much as resignation on the part of black people, when the spirituals, in his view, really are recounting an experience in hell. Like Du Bois talks in Black Reconstruction about when blacks were brought to America, they descended into hell. And you've got all of these lynchings going on every week, sometimes every other day. People fighting in the sunlight for body parts. Women with babies in their arms fighting for body parts in the L Persons lynching in Wolf River Bottoms in Memphis. So there was a hell going on, a hellish existence in a certain sense. But it was not all hell. But I mean, you have to account for the fact that there was this violence and segregation and so on and so forth.
Richard, let's go.
Professor Stuckey, one of the things that occurred to me about Robeson in your description of him is that he really appears kind of as a liminal figure, and constantly...
2 syllables. Robeson.
Robeson.
Robeson, okay.
And, you know, he's abroad in England and is learning African languages. He's using dialects and knows classics. His description of Princeton performs in Carnegie Hall and churches, and even his talking of blacks and whites being equal, he seems to be cognizant of various spaces at a time. Cognizant of various spaces, if not inhabiting both of those spaces. And I wonder if, in your observations of Robeson, if there were places that he could not or would not go, whether they were physical places or just sort of his own reflections on the world. Kind of, does he set up any boundaries that he's just not willing or able to? Well,
there was virtually no place he could go, even in the north. Restaurants and so on were often off limits to blacks, whether it was Robeson or Du Bois, no matter a doctor, black lawyer, whatever.
But do you mean it in that in the sense of?
I mean, both the physical, but like in the society, but also maybe in his reflections upon the world around him, and as history's unfolding, that he just sets up boundaries that he.
Well, you see him as a cosmopolitan.
He's very expansive,
right?
Globally, very expansive in languages that he learns. He learned about 12 or 13 languages, Greek, Latin. One of the few times that I heard him sort of brag was he reflecting on his college career. He says, I was quite a Greek scholar, that kind of thing. But places he couldn't go, there were places to which he went only to encounter humiliation. He goes into a Park Avenue apartment building, and the guy running the front of that building, the person who's at the front desk, takes him to the freight elevator to go upstairs, and until he finds out that a party was being given in Robeson's honor. And Robeson says, not to the man who did that, but in writing about it, said that was his idea of the Negro's way to heaven, the freight elevator, okay? So there were places to which he could go, and there was still discrimination. He could go into a restaurant with several white friends, and the owners would be outraged because he might have had his hat on. That happened. In general, he was much happier in England, but he would encounter discrimination in England as well. But I think I think that that's what that factor was significant in his admiration for the Soviet Union. When he went into the Soviet Union in the 1930s, it was, as one scholar has written, it was like a different planet. Not that there wasn't discrimination there as well. It might depend on the year or the day. So there were few places that, we could quote him on this, before he died, that he went where he wanted to go. When he was able, he went where he wanted to go. He said what he wanted to say. And now there's no point in having any more press conferences. So I've said what I had to say. I've gone where I wanted to go. But in going where he wanted to go, sometimes he encountered resistance. But there was...
Yeah, it's your question is interesting. I guess I would have put it a little differently. So what Stuckey seemed to have answered, attached to it a different set of answers. That is, it strikes me that as I'm learning from you, and as you know, I read other people reading Robeson, he got in trouble precisely because he thought himself free, that he could go anywhere, do it, you know, in his mind, and enter any kind of discourse, you know, the languages, cultures, and the like. But of course, the rest of the world wasn't ready for that, wasn't, you know, accepting of that. And so, but that does make him a kind of odd figure, and sort of so much before his time, and then after his death, it's just amazing, you know, how many schools named after him, how many, you know, organizations then, you know, welcoming, you know, Columbia saying, oh, well, we should have been a little nicer, you know, Rutgers and the like, embracing and the like. But that meant that he got into trouble precisely because he didn't see the kind of limits other people were setting up for him. And so teaches us a lot in that respect. And I still think that it's worth using him to think about the complexity of translation. I mean, not just of text, but how the self can grow, cultures, the complexity of a culture. So what was he doing? I mean, I'm just fascinated by this. I'm so far from being a critic of music, I don't know how to think about this yet, but what you said about what he was doing with the dialect, it seems very much like a mind working on the complexity of culture's various parts, how it can change and yet be sort of faithful to something else, or you know, the kind of pivot here and there, because there were people, of course, who had very strong opinions, who either felt none of that should be countenance, you know, Negro dialect, like Johnson and the like, and we should all fashion ourselves as sort of modern, you know, white men, and there were also others who had a kind of essentialist view of black culture and the like. So your very notion of what's Africanist, what's African, if you use the ring shout as an example, is all the more fascinating because it seems to me it's one of those ways out. It's so dynamic. It obviously travels and can change, but it doesn't make it any less African because of that. So he's just a great example.
This is fascinating. What Melville does in Moby Dick with the ring shout. See, ring shout's a counterclockwise dance to song. some people can be on the side clapping and so keeping time. Counterclockwise dance that, by the way, was being performed in New Brunswick a few years before Robeson's arrival. The great stride pianist James P. Johnson, who had a big influence on Fats Waller and an influence on Thelonious Monk, was in New Brunswick, falling asleep on his stairway while his parents and other relatives were downstairs ring shouting all night long. James P. Johnson influenced Duke Ellington on the piano too. So so it's ironic that it was going on in New Brunswick before Robeson's arrival. That ring shout was taking place there. So these developments were occurring. I think in Paul's case, Paul was very mindful of certain limits because so many of his people were being lynched. Okay? He's very mindful of certain limits because what he was reading in the Princeton, well, he was too young at the Princeton press, but all sorts of stereotypes about black people. All sorts of stereotypes occasionally in the Targum, which was the Rutgers newspaper. So you've got all these things going on, and yet, to be fair, I don't know that a college student was ever more greatly loved than Robeson was by the white students at Rutgers. Not by all of them, not by those on the football team. He was never made captain, but the reference was to Roby and the writing of a kind of anthem, dedication to Robeson by these students. When he graduated, they predicted that that he had dimmed the luster of Booker Washington and that he would one day be governor of New Jersey, the governor of white as well as black people. This they were writing in the student paper in 1919. It's very complex. And in a final editorial, the editorial was devoted to the depth of thought of the man, and his marvelous delivery and so on. So this was going on right there at Rutgers. And some students interviewed later said that they wanted to protest discrimination against Robeson, and Robeson said no. At first, I rejected that. The more I think about it, I think he probably did. I'm not at all of a mind that there were not students who didn't say, Paul, we want to protest how you were treated. I think that would be a very human sort of reaction from some of these students. And yet Paul, seeing the barbarity with which blacks generally were being treated, may have felt, well, I'm not particularly keen on socializing with these students anyway. Just, out of self-pride. Why should I be interested in socializing with them when my people are being so brutalized? And yet respecting them, some of them, certainly. It's a very complex issue.
Well, I think we better draw this to a close. Will you join me in expressing appreciation